Welcome back to Simply Money. Today we're diving into a topic that doesn't get talked about enough: financial trauma. If you've ever felt guilt, shame, or stress around money, this conversation is for you. I'm excited to have with me Rahkim Sabree, award-winning financial therapist and author of Overcoming Financial Trauma: How to Break Free from Guilt, Build Wealth, and Redefine Success. Rahkim, thank you so much for joining us.
Happy to be here, man. Thank you.
Before we get into the book, can you share a bit about your own journey? What inspired you to write about financial trauma in the first place?
Yeah, I've been in and around financial services for a while. I started in the banking industry in 2011, did 10 years in the banking industry. 2021, I decided to pursue full-time financial coaching. That looked different than how it showed up in my life. But when I left the bank and I decided to focus on financial coaching, what I focused on in kind of separating myself from other financial coaches was the mindset piece, right? So I stopped using the specific phrasing around financial literacy that I was hearing a lot of financial educators use and really focused on the phrasing financial empowerment. But in the process of articulating financial empowerment, right, we have to distinguish between the education piece and what is the barrier that prevents people from feeling empowered. And in the process of discovery and articulation of what that might be, I stumbled across financial trauma through research and studying that I was doing on generational trauma. And so, what does the transfer of trauma look like from an intergenerational lens? I thought that was really fascinating through more of the social work field and how trauma research was developing around what intergenerational transfer of trauma looked like and how that showed up in individual behaviors and attitudes when it came to things that were much more broad than money, but applied to money, I didn't hear anybody else talk about. So I started to run with the phrasing financial trauma. I thought actually I created it until I became acquainted with the Financial Therapy Association and the Association for Financial Counseling and Planning Education. And I'm like, oh, okay, there are whole fields of study and practice that specialize on more of the behavioral side of money. So not so much the math and the strategy, but how are people reacting to their circumstances? At this point, it's been almost 5 years now that I've been talking about financial trauma specifically. I've been very intentional about niching down in that way and staying committed to that niche because over the last 5 years, we've had the pandemic, the post pandemic, right? Trying to go back to normal, and then the economy in its various stages since then. And in that time period, I noticed a lot of entrepreneurs were jumping from trend to trend, right? Whether that was cryptocurrency wave, whether that was course creation around vending or real estate or what have you. And so I really wanted to commit to a space, become known for being in that lane and to contribute to that space as well. So when I first started talking about financial trauma 5 years ago, I didn't hear anybody else talking about it. Now you can't get away from it, right? Everybody's talking about money trauma or financial trauma. I'm happy that I was an early adopter, certainly, and I kind of staked my flag in discussing this important topic. And I have mixed feelings about the widespread kind of discussion around financial traumas. I think some conversations don't do it justice in the way that it's articulated and expressed. And other conversations, I think, just start to normalize what is this phrase that people are hearing? Like financial trauma sounds super provocative. It's an interesting time and space to be in, but when I had the opportunity to connect with an editor from Wiley, and they're like, do you have any ideas around how you want to position your book? Yeah, let's talk about financial trauma. And it's just because I had been talking about it for so long. So it was a natural progression, I think. But going through the process of actually writing the book was a new layer, I think, in understanding what does financial trauma look like? How does it manifest? What are my own financial traumas that surface in the way that I talk, write, teach around this topic? And what are the solutions that I can surface and provide for individuals looking for a way out?
Yeah, I think it's so fascinating. Just the title of your book, Overcoming Financial Trauma, to me was very catching because, I'm in the sphere of talking a lot about finances and, I am guilty of using financial literacy, financial education, just very generic terms, because my goal starting this channel was just to try to help people learn more about basic finances, a lot of things that people weren't exposed to. Maybe obviously schools don't teach it like they should. If they come from families and generations, like you said, that have not had that uh, background, or maybe they've had a negative background and how that impacts them. So just the word trauma really caught my attention because it is very traumatic for people. In fact, I've been reading your book, Financially Irresponsible, and I think it's your second chapter section. You talk about, you use the scripture from Timothy that the root of all evil, or money is the root of all evil, but then you go deeper into some of the nuances that are missed, but how that one little piece has been pasted everywhere, and it really impacts people. Like, oh, if I obtain money, I'm evil, or I'm associated with evil. I think your title and premise of this is amazing. Really excited for the book to be released in November. So when people hear this word trauma, they might think of like major life events and not money. I know I've never used trauma when talking about money, and that may be partially from my upbringing. I was not brought up wealthy. I was not fluent, but I wasn't poor. We were lower middle class, I guess would be about where we'd put it. My parents were very frugal. I learned a lot of money habits from them, some good, some bad. And I know I have things that are ingrained in me from not just my upbringing, but my total environment. So when people hear that, why is it important for them to recognize financial trauma as a very real form of trauma?
Yeah, I think it's a great question. And I think you said it right in your introduction there. We are often socialized not to associate money with trauma, right? And the approach that I took in writing this book and discussing financial trauma was an embodied approach that trauma research, step back for a second, trauma research has identified and validated that trauma is not just a psychological occurrence, right? It's just something that's in your head. It's an embodied experience. Many times trauma exists within our body, like we hold it there. So we talk about this idea of the intergenerational transfer of trauma, right? It's more than the ideas and the attitudes that we carry. It also has an impact on the expression of our genes, so through DNA, but how we react to the stress responses that we often hear: fight, flight, freeze, fawn, right? When you hear trauma and money in the same sentence, and we are often socialized not to make associations between the two, what we're effectively doing is ignoring the smoke alarm. So this is an analogy I use in the book. Sometimes when the smoke alarm needs a new battery, it chirps, right? And if you don't immediately change the battery, then the chirping fades into the background. You may not hear the battery chirping anymore because you become into it. But somebody may be on a Zoom call with you, or you may be recording a video on TikTok or whatnot, and they'll hear the chirping, like, why is this person not changing their battery, right? I use this analogy because I find that to be the case when it comes to money, right? Because we have not been socialized to view money as a threat, our body is responding to the threat that is present with money, but we don't hear it anymore. And
Sorry, I love that analogy about the fire alarm chirping, because my wife's going to get a kick out of this. When we went to her sister's, and her husband, they had a fire smoke detector that did that. The battery was gone all night long. We were laying there in the bed, like, and I finally woke up and went up and pulled the battery. I'm like, how do you not hear that? But that's a great analogy.
yeah, we get desensitized to the alarms that our body has internally, and these are evolutionary responses, right? And so because we can't process the difference between a real or a perceived threat, like our brain doesn't have the ability to distinguish between a real or perceived threat, what we think is happening, right, to our bodies. And so you don't have to go into the science and nerd out on the different parts of the brain and the amygdala and the prefrontal cortex, but I think sparing everybody that what we learn to do effectively through our socialization and navigating the financial systems that are present is ignore the threat that our body is responding to. And then we find ways, or we look for ways, ironically through money, to pacify that reaction, right? So where someone may show up as an avoidant manager of money, or they may engage in spending behaviors because they're looking to regulate their nervous system, or where somebody may show up as super vigilant, right? These are trauma responses. And a lot of the work that I've done in writing this book and just in trauma research, taking things a step further from what our traditional views on money management look like, taking it out of the lens of shame and blame and guilt and this concept of education being the catch-all, and saying, well, what is the reason why an educated individual will still engage in these behaviors, right? Why is our feeling or emotions overriding what it is that we know that we should be doing, or what it is that we believe that we should be doing? And so that comes down to a question of what our values look like. That comes down to a question of what are we responding to? That comes down to a question of the reactions that we have to navigating these systems, right? I talk about advertising a lot when I talk about financial trauma, because advertising science ties our emotions to the sale, right? So advertisers are very conscious of the fact that if they approach this advertisement from a purely rational perspective, people will not buy, or they certainly won't buy in the volume that they will if we tie it to an emotional outcome. So when we think that we need something to be better, to feel better, to look better, right? To demonstrate love, to have love from other people, we make these associations through how we spend our money. And unfortunately, the reality is that all day we're being bombarded from the time we wake up to the time that we go to sleep with advertising or messaging that says, you need this, you need this, you need this. What chance do we really have in terms of a fighting chance to resist this constant tug in the direction of spending? Even if we have the education that say, well, you know what, I should be conscious of what I spend, right? Like, if your child is crying and they feel that you don't love them because you're not spending money on the newest gadget, like that, I mean, some parents will be like, listen, you'll figure it out at some point. But I think it's harder, right? When you're navigating a secondary relationship on top of your own relationship with money, because you have expectations, values, needs, wants, desires, right? That can show up through how you are trying to regulate your nervous system. But then you also have your partner or your child or your friends or whatever your network looks like. And so there's so many variables that exist that influence our relationship with money in, I would say, a negative way. And that is ultimately how I define financial trauma: any instance observed or experienced that has a negative impact on the way you view, interact with, or believe about money. And so I break down financial trauma into different sources, but I think that to your question, to your point, it really comes down to the socialization around money, or financial socialization.
No, and I think that's great. The whole socialization, and you talked about marketing and all. We are saturated, and I would agree with you more of the negative aspects of money, not what's going to make you better, but what makes you feel better immediately, that instant gratification. We don't see a lot of advertising on the new iPhone, but make sure you have this in your budget first, or make sure this isn't going to put you in a
Of
bad
course not.
position with your family. Don't spend your lunch money on the new Nikes, kid, or whatever. You don't
Right.
obviously approach it that way. And I think it's important too, this whole trauma talk, or not talk, but the verbiage, people that have PTSD, they could, like, I always use the example, two people going through a war and seeing the same things and experiencing the same things, but they process it differently. And when they come back, one may be a recluse. They may, lock themselves away from society. Another may overcompensate by becoming super extroverted. And everyone deals with trauma so differently. And it's not just based on the experience that created the trauma. Like you said, it's so many other aspects that we don't even recognize, that, when the trauma happened, what had led up to that kind of determines which direction they go from there. How well do they process the trauma? How well do they, navigate through? If I make a financial mistake, do I just say, oh, I blew my budget this month. Oh, I'm such a loser. I'll never make anything. And so I just keep spending because that makes me feel good for a moment. And then I'm just compounding my choice that I made at that one instant. So Um, your book gets into what you've trademarked, if I have this correct, the 3E framework. And I obviously I appreciate you doing this interview prior to the book coming out. I've been able to read some of your stuff that talks about the book, so I feel a little unprepared interviewing, not having read the full book, and I don't want to have you spoiler alert anything. But can you kind of explain where the 3E framework comes from and what it's based on without giving away the secret sauce?
Yeah, well, I've been talking about the 3 E's for a while, so there's no worry there. It comes from my own experience, actually. So what's I think unique about this book and the way that I'm positioning it is that it is informed by my experience, it's informed by my practice, and it's informed by my education, right? So learning about financial therapy and learning about trauma, specifically trauma research, practicing as a financial therapist and financial counselor with people. So what is it that I'm seeing in the work that I do with clients? And then what are the experiences that I've had that have informed my perspective, my attitude, what it is that I feel I've overcome, resilience. And so the 3 E's are exposure, education, and execution. And it is a progressive framework that talks about how the identification of trauma, right? So if we give it a name, label it, moving into education, where it's like, okay, this is what's happening in your body, or this is where the financial education piece comes in, this phase. And then the execution is like, okay, now it's time for you to do the work, put it all together, right? I'll tell you a quick story. 3E framework came out of my journey into home ownership. When I was growing up, I lived in an apartment with my mom. I became aware of the fact that we had Section 8 probably around the time I was 15. My parents had separated. And so I helped her with some of the administration of that finances in the household, which included, taking money over to property management so that we could pay their rent. During that period of time, I started to, we talk about financial socialization, start making associations between what was my lived reality and what was my future. So I thought to myself, when I become an adult and I'm independent, I'm going to go out and I'm going to get an apartment and I'm going to get Section 8. And this is the process that exists now. So this is the process that will exist in the future. It didn't occur to me at that time that home ownership was possible or likely for me, and certainly not before 30. Fast forward a little bit, I come into the banking industry, 2011, and I have some coworkers and some friends who own homes, and they're like within 5 years of my age, and I'm like, whoa, like you can have a house at this young. And so it just turned everything that had started to believe on its side, and then I became extremely motivated or driven to learn everything that I could about what's involved in the home ownership process, right? Where do I need to get my credit? Who do I need to talk to? Who needs to be on my team? What professionals do I need to line up? How much money do I need to have? What does my income need to look like? All of the factors. And so that's the education piece, right? Made manifest. And then fast forward more, I'm in the home buying process, right? I'm pre-qualified. I have the income, I have the credit, I have the resources, and I start to second guess myself in this process. And I'm like, I don't know, like, what if I can't afford to replace the roof and the roof needs to be replaced? Or what if I can't afford to replace the water heater or, any number of things that come with home ownership. And because I didn't have a frame of reference for home ownership before that, my panic around all of these what if scenarios that I was creating in my mind almost talked me out of moving forward with the purchase. This is the execution phase, which I describe as being the most difficult part because you're coming face to face with the actual trauma of your previous experiences and subsequent ideas and associations that come from that experience. What really helped me through that period was the building of community through the friends who had been through that process and the reassurance that they gave me and saying, hey, these things are things that may or may not happen. If they do happen, this is what you can do. If they don't happen, you have a house, right? Like you'll figure it out. It's okay. And I took that experience and I kind of expound on it through the development of this framework and moving people through the journey as I had moved through the journey. Of course, putting some trauma informed lenses and some financial counseling and financial therapy informed lenses on it to really bolster it. And to your point, recognize that everybody's reaction to trauma is going to look different. It's going to feel different. And so, what are the resources or the tools or the variables that will be present in addressing this trauma, right? And I think that the first step is identifying what is the source of this trauma so that we can kind of get under the hood and start focusing on. I use the word overcoming. The word that came to my mind was resolving, but I use the word overcoming because it is present progressive. And so I don't think that you can go and erase trauma. I don't, in hindsight, I don't think that there's any value in going and erasing the trauma, right? Like it shapes you. But I think that when we talk about this process of overcoming, we can acknowledge that whatever happened, happened, and we can start building resilience around how we move forward by taking what happened and using it as fuel or using it as a launch pad to the subsequent phases in this 3E process. And that's where it came from. I like to kind of teach in themes, and so I thought the 3 E's was catchy, and exposure, education, execution would be something that people could remember. And so that's how it came to be.
That's great. I say a lot on my channel when I'm talking about whether it's budgeting, investing, I always say personal finances are personal. And
Absolutely.
we live, I think, the bulk of what you'll find on YouTube, TikTok, all that social media, we live in the educational part of the 3 E's. Lots of
Yes.
education, but there's so many contradictory teachings. And I think that problem is because we don't have the 2 E's on the both ends. First, exposing what is your financial trauma, what is your financial mindset to better help you educate what fits you, not what fits me. And then obviously the execution is times lacking. We give lots of education, but we don't give the step by step. And that was something I don't have such catchy things like you, but that's something I wanted to do was try to give some whether it's basic how to start a budget to how to start investing, how to get out of debt, different methods. But I always boil it down to you have to choose what's going to fit you. But the exposure part is something I really enjoyed from what I've been reading from your stuff is it helps name it. We don't have names in the financial realm of trauma. Everything else we have the MSD 4 or 5 wherever we're at in the psychological manual. Um, I don't know. Is money in there? I've never looked. I'd be interested to see if they have financial trauma in there yet.
So financial trauma was not in there. It was interesting about kind of the interdisciplinary field of financial therapy as it's emerging is that there are money disorders identified and coined by some financial psychologists and financial therapists, but they're not recognized by the DSM-5 yet. The hope is that we can get that to be recognized. What is recognized across both are addiction and hoarding disorders, right? So those show up sometimes as money behaviors, which I mean, from where I'm standing, I think everything is connected, right? So a holistic view of money is going to include what are the ways that we are using money, whether it be to help us or to harm us, and where people, just in the classic sense of hoarding, right? People are accumulating things. Well, how do they get those things, right? A lot of times they have to spend their money. When we look at the classic view of addiction, how are they getting the things that they're addicted to? They have to spend money, right? Sometimes the lens on these disorders are specifically or hyper fixated on the money piece in a way that is saying, okay, hoarding, you might be hoarding money by stashing it under your mattress or in a safe or in your bank account, or you might have addictive practices that cause you to spend money in excess. But I think all in all, like, and you said it beautifully, we often silo these experiences as this is what it is from let's call it the financial planning or the financial services perspective. This is what it is from a mental health perspective. And everybody is so protective of their stuff, right? The mental health community so protective of their stuff, financial planning community so protective of their stuff. But we're all human beings, and we're all, I think, I've been playing around with this phrasing. What financial trauma reveals is that absent of the class-based hierarchies that we subscribe to, right? We're all the same, right? Because regardless of how much money you make or what assets you hold, the evolutionary responses to danger, right? Fight, flight, freeze, fawn, like that's hardwired into us as human beings. And so financial trauma reveals that regardless of where you are on your income or asset spectrum, because even if you are a top earner, right? What you perceive as a threat to what it is that you're earning or what it is that you've accumulated by way of assets is going to trigger the same response as an individual who is perceiving the threat that may be experiencing poverty. Now, how real that threat is going to it's going to look different for the individual that's experiencing it, right? And so, like you said, trauma looks different depending on the individual. So you talk about personal finance being personal, like absolutely, but our reaction to the quote unquote danger, real or imagined, is going to be the same across the board. And so I think when we talk about providing these tools or providing a trauma informed lens on financial education, like those are the variables that are important, absent the guilt and the shame that we see so prevalent in financial education communities, right? They, oh, you should have done this, or you should have done this by this time, or you should be doing this. There's a lot of like pointing of the finger. And the individual many times is making the best decision that they know how to make in that moment.
That just makes me think about, like, I talk a lot about the stock market, and I'm guilty of this. And so, to all my viewers, I apologize. I always say when the market's dipping, don't panic. That's easy for me to say because of where I'm at and what I've been through in my life, what I've witnessed, what I've experienced. Where some people, they say, okay, I'm going to finally take the step and I'm going to invest into an ETF or an index fund or a stock that I think is going to do, however they approach it, and then they go through their first, bear market, and they freak out and they sell. And, that's a knee jerk reaction to that trauma or whatever else has happened. And they make a mistake because they don't know, it hasn't been, exposed. They haven't been educated and they haven't been given, that execution. And I think that bringing us all to the human level, that we all have the same choices. We just all react different. If you put me back in, the Serengeti, thousands of years ago, and I hear rustling in the bushes, is that going to kill me or not? Is it the wind? What is it?
Yep.
I'm probably running. I don't have the skill set to, if it is a lion, I don't have the skill set how to kill it. So I'm running because of my experience and exposure. So I really love how you're bringing this to light because I think it'll help me in educating and trying to bring information to help slow down a little bit and help people expose their individual situations, their traumas. When you talk a lot in your writings about the nervous system dysregulation and how money isn't just our head, like you said earlier, that it's in our body. And I forget what article it was you were quoting about. I don't even know if I say this right, so you can correct me. Epigenetics.
Yes,
And can you tell us a little bit what that is and how that applies to this book and what you're talking about?
for sure. So epigenetics speaks to the influences that express how, I shouldn't use the word express because I'm going to use it again. The variables that influence how genes are expressed. And so epigenetics is more, or rather, it emerged more from a biological science perspective. And so when we look at what are the environmental variables, like, I'll just kind of give you some solid examples, the food that we eat or the quality of the air that we breathe, or primarily those things will start there that influence how genes are expressed. Trauma research has looked at epigenetics and said, how can we measure whether or not stress and or trauma has an influence on the way that genes are expressed? And does that influence pass on through generations? So there was a researcher by the name of Rachel Yehuda, who was a trauma researcher. who applied the trauma research to epigenetics and found that in victims of the Holocaust, their immediate descendants had, and they had a certain protein, I don't remember what it was called, but basically a marker genetically that had changed based off of the atrocities associated with the Holocaust. And so this kind of proved and connected these two fields of study that stress can influence how genes are expressed. Now, what does that look like? Well, you talk about, we'll just go back to your example of PTSD and two soldiers, right? If those soldiers' parents or grandparents had different levels of exposure to stress that influence the way that genes are expressed, they may be more or less predisposed to a sensitivity to the stress hormone cortisol and may react to the stress with a shorter bandwidth for resilience or a greater bandwidth for resilience based off of the experiences that their grandparents had or that their parents had, right? So when we apply this science to, and this is all correlated science, there's not been specific studies in epigenetics tied to money yet. But when we draw these parallels between how trauma influences the way that genes are expressed, particularly as it relates to stressful situations or what sustained stress looks like, and we tie sustained stress markers to experiences like poverty or to experiences like the Great Depression or to experiences like you name it, right? The COVID pandemic and the subsequent recession, right? These things not only change how our genes are expressed in our lived experience, like first person, but what future generations may experience. And so it's really a fascinating and emerging area of science, but I've really kind of hooked into that as I talk about financial trauma through a lens that is slightly different than I think how financial trauma had been previously discussed, which really just focuses on the first person experience, right? If I am an individual who experienced job loss, who experienced homelessness, who experienced repossession, yes, those are classic like tells of, oh, you've experienced this flashpoint financial experience, you may have financial trauma. But I think less frequently, much less frequently, do we acknowledge how the variables of observing how others are responding to the threat of money, right? So we're children and we're watching our parents stress out over potentially having a foreclosed home or working hard all their lives and losing it all. Like that has an effect on us. And so I name that vicarious or observational trauma. If we're not talking about the conversations of how our parents or our grandparents or our great grandparents may have experienced financial hardship. And not only are the messages that are communicated through the cultural norms that are established within our families, are the words that we communicate around money, the value of money, or rather this disdain for individuals that have money, as you make reference to the often misquoted scripture of money being the root of all evil. There's also what's happening biologically that is being passed down. And these are, I don't want to call them secondary, but I think for the sake of this conversation, secondary or third party experiences that influence our relationship with money. And so I think that that embodied piece is so important because trauma research has proven, again, that trauma is a body experience, like it's a somatic experience. And when we tie back to epigenetics, when we tie back to gene expression and the variables of stress inducing hormones and how we cope and regulate what that looks like, I don't think that we can have a conversation about financial trauma without acknowledging these variables.
Sorry, that is just amazing to me because so much just came to my head when you're talking about that. I talk a lot about obviously the first person. We all can kind of identify that. That's the easy one. I've lost a job. I've gone bankrupt. I've dealt with these things, so I can identify that very easily. And then the secondary, as you were talking about, I've used the example like my grandparents went through the Great Depression, so they were very frugal. My grandmother would open Christmas presents and refold up all the paper because she'd reuse it, or would get our birthday presents wrapped in the Sunday funnies, just all the little things and how that impacted me through a secondary. But the genetical part to me is amazing because I think that brings even a deeper exposure to what could be happening. Because you'll hear people in outside of money talking about, well, these two people went through a similar trauma, whether it's the soldiers or whatever, and they had even siblings. They were brought up by the same families in the same household, and they went through the same trauma, but one reacts totally different than another. I'll use myself as an example. I'm much more risky when it comes to money. I have a much higher risk tolerance. I'm not a gambler. I'm not a chance person, but I have a higher risk tolerance. My sister, raised in the same house, same parents, only a couple years older than me. She's very frugal and an amazing saver. She's a better saver than me, but I'm a better investor than her. And we've talked a lot in recent years about the power of investing in different ways of building wealth beyond just saving because the evil thing of inflation. But what you talk about, that genetic, people say, well, you're the same family. Well, my brother has blonde hair and I had black hair before it turned gray. We have different genes that have been passed down from the same grandparents and great grandparents. So I think that's very fascinating. I can't wait to read more on that. I think what you're talking about is something that really needs to be researched more and further insight and definitely more exposure for people to understand these things and how it goes beyond what we're kind of used to hearing the first person. I thank you for the work you're doing with that. I think's amazing.
Appreciate that. Yeah, my hope is that more people start creating bridges between the disciplines, right? In the writing of this book, I looked at your traditional financial planning and financial therapy and financial counseling, and these are all splinters of the same industry. And then looked at trauma research, and then also looked at neuroscience, and then also looked at social theory, right? And also looked at race theory and looked at economic theory through capitalism, right? So I'm looking at all of these different lenses and all of these different disciplines and creating a bridge. And so, as I shared earlier, a lot of what we're taught, and specifically with money, how we're socialized is very siloed. So it's just like, it's this, and then we can have a parallel conversation that may be related, but because it's not related, we're not going to let those two things cross paths. And I think that my eyes were really open when I started looking at the trauma research. And I'm like, why? Like, why are we not including this in the conversations that we have around money? And I bridge those things, and especially within the healing piece. So I was reading Becoming Supernatural by Dr. Joe Dispenza, and Dr. Joe Dispenza talks about, he's a neuroscientist, but he also talks about quantum theory. And in this book in particular, he talks about how by through future self visualization and affirmations, you can effectively change your reality in the future, right? And then he goes into his research that proves this. What I thought was really interesting, it kind of borders on the line of, woo woo, but what I thought was really interesting is when he talks about this future self visualization, he talks about the role of affirmations and rewiring your brain, right? Rewiring these neural pathways or creating new neural pathways. He also talks about like the vibrations of gratitude and love as being the conduit for what that change looks like. And when I talk about financial healing in the book, I pull from Dr. Dispenza's work and talk about the value of using affirmations in helping to heal your money wounds. Because as you shared about yourself and your sister, I share about myself and my brother in one of the earlier chapters of this book, where both my brother is, I think, 16 months younger than I am. Like, we couldn't be closer to being twins. But we also have very different perspectives on money, very different money stories based off of our upbringing, even though we've experienced almost exactly the same thing up to a point. And I have a younger sister who was 6 years younger than I am, who had a very different experience. Right. So you think about how at one time we all lived in the same household. but the experiences and the observations and the roles that we took, that we played in the household, me being the oldest, my sister being the youngest, my brother being in the middle, like all of those variables are going to influence how we start to become socialized and develop stories around money or narratives around money that show up in our adulthood comes time to navigate our finances by ourselves. And so I was very independent financially because I had to be, right? I played that role in the household. My sister is, I think, of the three of us, the least independent when it comes to her finances, but she had the benefit of two older brothers, right? To say her, like, hey, this is what you should do. Hey, this like when my sister was 16 years old, I made her an authorized user on one of my credit cards. So when she turned 18, like she had an 800 credit score, right? Or close to 800. She had high 700s. But I think about how I was able to afford her that gift and how nobody was, not that nobody was, but my parents didn't know any better. So nobody was
Right.
there to afford me the same. And so all of these variables matter. And yes, from a genetic perspective, I think the epigenetic studies is fascinating, but also just from a cultural perspective, like what is our family culture? And I'm not talking about me specifically, I'm talking about people in general. Like when you look at what is your family culture around money? How do we prioritize money? What does money mean to us? What does it represent to us? How did our families use money? All of those things are going to register in childhood based off of what we observe and what we're told and what we hear, but it's also going to stay with us. And then we have to cross a bridge where we decide in our adulthood, is it something that we want to hold on to? Is it something that we want to release? And more times than not, we're operating in autopilot when it comes to our finances. You have to make a conscious decision to go against what has been ingrained from the time you were a child. And many people don't have that reckoning unless they're forced with financial hardship.
So, in your book, I'm assuming because you do talk about exposure, so you probably dive in a little bit about how to identify different things and the educational piece. As far as execution part, do you have in the book like practical steps and tips or exercises for people to do to help them after they've identified some of their trauma? And obviously, reading the book, they'll be getting educated on a lot of that steps for them to take, or is it more analytical or academic?
Combination of all of the above.
Okay.
And that was by design, right? So when I introduced the 3E framework, the book follows the framework. So the book is broken into three parts. Within the exposure piece, I talk about the six sources of financial trauma, as I've been writing about lately. In the education piece, I talk about financial education, where financial education fails, how I talk about the neuroscience or the triune brain, how does trauma show up in our body. I talk about financial systems and how there is sometimes a mistrust that is present when it comes to engaging financial systems and why that is and what financial institutions can do to reach back and re-engage with the communities that they want to serve. And in the execution phase, which is the last part of the book, I talk about how to build a financial wellness program. So it's targeting HR professionals. I talk about how to build or how to establish financial boundaries. I think that's the first chapter in the third part. So when we talk about practical, like, okay, how do we establish financial boundaries? How do we rewrite our money narratives? How do we identify what our money narrative is, first of all, but how do we rewrite our money narrative? Then I go on to different methods of healing. So I talk about financial therapy, but I also talk about somatic work. I talk about the affirmations. I talk about exercises like the financial genogram. So that's an exercise that mental health practitioners use where basically you write out a family tree, but at each level of the family tree, you are writing down what your observable money behaviors look like or money like hiccups look like. So if you know that grandpa was a gambler, you might put that on grandpa's line. If you know that dad was super frugal, you might put that on dad's line. If you know that your sister is a great saver, but maybe not so risk averse, you might put that on your family line. And then you look for patterns across the different generations so that you can kind of zoom out and not look at this as an experience that you are having by yourself, but an experience that is collective and that there are so many different influences that may stem from what is passed down from generation to generation. What else I talk about? I talk about body scans, doing box breathing exercises, and then focusing on where in your body do you feel your financial stress, right? So when we start talking about budgeting, or you start talking about saving, or you start talking about making any financial decision, do you feel it in your body? A lot of times people feel it like in their solar plexus. A lot of times people might feel it in their shoulders. I know when I'm stressed out, I feel it in my shoulders and my back. And so focusing on these body scans, so going from the top of your head down to your toes and seeing, okay, where does this show up in my body? And really getting you reacquainted with paying attention to your body, because as I shared earlier, we're so often socialized to ignore the alarms that our bodies are giving us when it comes to money. And then there's a sizable section where I do an interview with a good friend of mine who is a financial therapist and Reiki master, because in the process of writing the book, I actually decided that I wanted to walk the walk. And so I signed up for a financial therapy session with him, and he did a Reiki session with me, and we walked through his process, financial therapy. And so I allowed him to talk about Reiki and why he feels Reiki is not only so essential to his practice, but why he feels Reiki, which is an energy healing practice, and somatic healing practices are necessary in the healing of money wounds. And so I wanted to give the audience a very holistic experience when it came to the book. There are definitely academic tones in there. There are definitely narrative driven conversational tones in there. And then there are definitely some practical tones in there. It's like, this is what you can do right now. This is what you can do as you finish this book to get you started on the journey.
I love, I'm just, again, I'm so anxious to read the book because so many books provide the educational piece and miss the execution piece. Or YouTube, we do it too often. But beyond just, okay, like I talk about doing a budget, like, okay, this is how you can do a budget. This is one way, not the only way. This is one way to do a budget, but it misses probably a third of my audience who I'll get it in the comments like, budgets, who needs a budget? Like they're having that verbal reaction because something in their body is like, budget. And so thank you. You're giving me some tools to help us. Hey, take a deep breath. Why
Yeah.
are you so adamant that you don't want a budget? Let's see. Are you feeling it? Are you clenching
Where
your
are you feeling
fist?
it in your body? Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, that's awesome. And seeing that, like you said, the intersection of the different fields coming together, because we are holistic beings. We don't operate in boxes and in separate rooms. Like, oh, I'm going to go into my finance room and my family trauma, my stress for my kids, my wife, whatever, my work. I want to ask you one more question here. Can you tell me the 6 sources of financial trauma that you discuss? I know it's in the book, it's in some of your articles, but just for the audience, what are kind of to help them get their initial exposure at a very high level overview? What are those 6 sources of trauma?
Yeah. I appreciate you asking. So first is genetic or generational. So I categorize those two together. Second is vicarious or observational. So that is what you might observe through financial socialization as well, right? We talk about, or we don't, but I talk about how many times we are socialized to develop a disdain for individuals who don't have money, right? Even when we look at the criminalization of the homeless, I think that's the biggest example where a lot of our money decisions are based subconsciously on this idea that I don't want to be like them, right? And so we position ourselves through what we do, how we represent, or how we present rather, as being better than we or better off than we are because we don't want to be associated with the have-nots. The third is poverty and financial instability. So those are your classic financial trauma markers. Fourth is workplace or employment. So I talk about workplace and employment financial trauma, and actually I just wrote an article about that, and that was my most popular of the 6 sources so far. People really resonate with this idea of, especially in today's world, the workplace as being kind of a battlefield, right? And so we're engaged in economic warfare. Many times people are working jobs that they don't like, but they can't escape because they have obligations financially. And so they have to do the maneuvering in the way that they have to maneuver in order to continue to get a paycheck. And that causes stress and strain in a lot of ways. And for some people, it is their exit point for corporate America. For me, that was the case. Let's kind of talk about like what is this pipeline that is present when we look at entrepreneurs who become entrepreneurs because they're trying to escape trauma of their workplace. But then I also talk about in that book what the experience of trauma as a entrepreneur looks like, right? I give that aside because I think it would be hypocritical and unfair for me to kind of represent or misrepresent what that experience has looked like. Fourth is the institutional and systemic. So I talk about how navigating systems, whether they be financial systems, whether it be capitalism, whether it be embedded racism, how those things can cause trauma. That can cause people to disengage from financial systems. Often does cause people to disengage from financial systems because they don't trust the financial systems. And then the last one is family, societal, or religious. I group those together. And that kind of speaks to how, and this book was really, while I was writing this book, I was thinking about a particular avatar. So it's for everybody, but the avatar that I was thinking of was somebody who's a first generation high income earner. And so, what is the transition from watching your parents struggle to you making both your parents' salaries, right? Or you making more than anybody that you know? And what is the sense of obligation that you might have to provide for everybody else, right? And so there's like this focus and iteration and reiteration of the concept of put on your oxygen mask first before you go and try to help everybody else. And this applies to your finances. But how do you establish boundaries in an environment where culturally you are expected to? And so within that same source, I also talk about religion because sometimes people are feel pressure to make certain decisions financially based off of their spiritual practice. And so I'm very careful when I talk about religion to not condemn or trigger people and saying, hey, what you believe is wrong, but to hold up a mirror and say, hey, I want you to examine how what you believe may have an impact on what your financial decision making looks like. And so that was the last one of the six. Genetic, generational, vicarious, or observational, financial instability or poverty, systemic or institutional, workplace or employment, and familial, societal, or religious.
A couple things came to my mind when you were talking about that. The workplace one, I always think about the quote. I believe it was J.L. Collins in Simple Path to Wealth. He calls it FU money. He says, getting yourself in a place where if the stress or the job becomes so much, you can say FU and you have the means by which to not be stuck, for lack of better words. But obviously not everybody's there or feels like they can get there. I think that's the big thing. One of the barriers that financial trauma, like, well, I'll never be financially independent or whatever phrase they use, gets them in that mentality. The other thing you were talking about, the familial or societal pressure, it made me think of particularly athletes coming up from poverty. And all of a sudden, here's a $20 million contract and they have all their buddies, their mom, their sisters, whatever, and they feel that obligation and they end up not only losing the ability to take care of them, but lose the ability to take care of themselves and they go bankrupt as soon as their career's over. And when you see people like, I think of Shaquille O'Neal, who has obviously done tremendous for himself, but has set up very strong teaching opportunities for his children. He makes them bring a business plan if they want money. Hey, Dad, I want to open up this business. He doesn't just hand them a check. He's like, you need to propose to me like I'm a venture capitalist. Present me a plan. So he's passed on not only the ability that he's gotten, but teaching them other things beyond the money, like life skills. Not everyone has that opportunity. So I think that a lot can be said there. And I'm sure in the book you'll get into a lot of great anecdotes and different situations to help people connect to that. I really appreciate this, Rakim. This has been fantastic. Again, I'm so excited for the book. Tell us again, when's the book going to be released?
The book is due for release November 12th, I believe, 2025. Definitely that week. It is available for pre-order right now, and that's going to be available everywhere. So Barnes and Noble, Amazon, Books A Million. If you want to support an independent bookstore, so if you don't want to give just Jeff Bezos your money, you can also buy through bookshop.org, and you would select your favorite independent retailer. But yeah, the book it's published by Wiley's. There's a lot of distribution channels available. You can get it wherever you want to get a book from.
Now, do you have a website that they can go to and order it straight off your website, or does it link to these different?
Yeah, so from my website, it does link to different sources, but I could get my website. That's fine. My website is rahkimsabree.com, so it's just my name. But yeah, you can get
Okay.
it.
And I'll put I'll put your website down in my description below for anybody that wants to check out not only your website, but your Facebook, your YouTube, any other avenues you have. I know you've done TED Talks, a lot of great resources, several other books. So I'll put all that information down in the description below for anybody that's wanting to dive into this stuff. Go ahead and pre-order your book now, and then maybe we can do a video together where we talk about the book and we can get comments from people who have read it. That'd be great. So, Rahkim, if you could leave my audience with one piece of advice to start overcoming financial trauma today, what would it be?
Yeah, recognize or not recognize, pay attention to what your body is telling you in response to your real or imagined threat when it comes to money, right? I'll leave you with these two questions. Where do you feel money when you think about it? Where do you feel it in your body? And then two, what does money represent to you? And I'll leave it at that, right? I don't want to guide the answer, but think about, what does money represent to you? If you had to pick one word to respond, what does money represent to you? And definitely leave those responses in the comments, and I'll definitely check in on them.
I appreciate that so much. So thank you so much for sharing your wisdom and your story with us, Rahkim. And for everyone watching, remember, breaking free from your financial trauma isn't just about money. It's about reclaiming your life. Don't forget to check out Rahkim's book, Overcoming Financial Trauma, being released in November of 2025. And we'll see you next time on Simply Money.